So it looks like everyone's back, I think. Yeah. So this evening, as I mentioned, I'd like to talk a little about hope, because I think it's a really important topic in these times. And I don't think it's an overstatement to say that we're living at a time of unprecedented crisis, and that there are widespread feelings of fear, despair, sadness, anger, loneliness, all those yucky mental states. And in these dark days, these days that can seem dark even though we're almost at the longest day, we need, I think, an authentic sense of hope. A sense of hope that's based in potentiality and possibility, on aspiration and intention, rather than craving and expectation. And I think this is really the essence of the type of hope offered by the Buddha. Now, I spent most of my working career at the interface of science and environmental policy, especially looking at the human health effects of poor environmental quality. And over the years, I worked for government agencies and international agencies and all sorts of organizations. And I worked on many different health problems with environmental origins: climate disruption, toxic chemicals, air and water pollution. And over the years of my career, the scientific evidence got more and more showing that how much our health is affected by the environment. And as the science increased, my background is I have a doctorate in biochemistry. So that's how I got into this. But as the years went by, I became increasingly afraid and sad and angry and scared and hopeless about human disregard for the earth and the future that we are leaving our children and our grandchildren. And at the same time, it also became clear to me that the ecological, social, and health crises that we're witnessing are actually symptoms of something even larger. What I might call a crisis of the end of modernity. And by modernity, I mean that historical period of approximately the last 400 to 500 years that's been marked by strong beliefs in limitless growth and colonialism, science and technology being able to solve all our problems, rationality and reason, economics, materialism, human supremacy, and hyper-individualism. And in a way, as scary and awful as the ecological and social crises are that are now unfolding, they're really powerful warning signs of this much larger crisis that stems, I think, fundamentally from our disconnection, our separation, our alienation from our own hearts, alienation from our own bodies, alienation from other human beings, and of course from the earth itself. And as I got more and more in touch with all of this over the years, the more I spiraled down and down. And so about 15 years ago, this overwhelming hopelessness about our future, and talking to people and finding out that many people felt similarly as I did, led me to launch what I called a personal inquiry into hope. And I found myself increasingly asking questions like, how can I be hopeful in the face of so many crises? How can I sustain and nurture a realistic sense of hope when everything seems to be falling apart? And is it even possible to be hopeful in these times? Maybe you've asked yourself similar questions, especially recently. Now, at this point, you may be saying, hold on a moment, I'm Buddhist. I'm trying to get rid of my hope because it's all about craving. And isn't that the cause of suffering? Of course, I'm not going to disagree with you on that, but I do invite you to listen to what I've got to say. And then if you still want to get rid of all your hope, please go ahead and try. But to get back to my inquiry, so I was taught to use a dictionary. And so I started by looking up what this seemingly simple four-letter word means. And most dictionary definitions of hope use words like desire and fulfillment and expectation. The Oxford English Dictionary, which of course is my go-to, you can tell I'm English originally, says that hope is the expectation of something desired. Webster's, slightly more American tone here, says that it is desire with the expectation of fulfillment. So these definitions of hope are based on the expectation of attaining desirable outcomes in the future. In other words, wanting things that are outside our present day experience and anticipating or expecting that life will give them to us. And I call this extrinsic hope because it's based on hoping for improvements in our conditions or our circumstances. It's based on hoping for something better. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. When I was very young, I really wanted to win a Nobel Prize. Didn't mind which one, anyone would do. And my yearning was so strong that I could imagine myself standing on that stage in Oslo or Stockholm or wherever at the awards ceremony and being feted by the international community for whatever my wonderful work had been. But of course, as I got older, I realized that my hope was unrealistic. I wasn't particularly smart or creative. I wasn't going to be a world leader. In other words, my hope was born of a dream of wishful thinking and naive optimism. In some ways, I deluded myself into believing that if I hoped to win a Nobel Prize enough, reality would somehow conform to my desire and I'd win one. And I think we all harbor these types of hopes, maybe not to win a Nobel Prize, but we all harbor these types of extrinsic hopes. And at their root, at their core, there's always an I or a we that perceives something we don't have and turns it into a want or a need. And what I'm calling extrinsic hopes can be selfish, self-centered, as in my hope to win a Nobel Prize, or they can be altruistic, as in hopes to end the climate crisis and social injustice. Either way, this type of hope comes from a perception of inadequacy or a lack, a craving, and an expectation that the problem, because there's always a problem, can be fixed by attaining something in the external world. It's all about what I want or think or need should happen. In other words, extrinsic hopes, even if they are altruistic, are based on the notion of self. I, me, mine, and something outside myself, something other than myself that I believe will make me or make others happy. Of course, we generally regard altruistic hopes as much more worthy and virtuous than self-centered ones. So it's even easier to believe that life should give us what we want when our extrinsic hopes are altruistic. After all, if life is inherently good, shouldn't it comply with our well-intentioned wishes for others' happiness, for others' well-being? But unfortunately, life doesn't work that way. Our altruistic hopes may be very worthy and noble, but that's no guarantee that they'll be fulfilled any more than our self-centered hopes, right? Extrinsic hope, whether it's self-centered or altruistic, is doomed to failure for one very simple reason. We can't control life. We can't control other people. And because we can't control what happens, whenever we have expectations about what we think should happen or what we want to happen, we'll suffer when life gives us something we don't want. Of course, this is probably not news to any of you. This is basic Buddhism. What I'm calling extrinsic hope is always accompanied by a whole bunch of, I'm just going to call them yucky emotions for now. And one of them, I want to talk about some of them a little bit. One of them is fear. Because whenever we hope for something, there's an automatic fear that we won't get it. Meg Wheatley, who's an author and Buddhist, said this. She said, "A wild ride between hope and fear is unavoidable. Fear is the necessary consequence of feeling hopeful. Contrary to our belief that hope and fear are opposites, where one trumps the other, they are a single package, bundled together as intimate and eternal partners. Hope never enters a room without fear at its side. If I hope to accomplish something, I'm also afraid I'll fail. You can't have one without the other." End of quote. Extrinsic hopes, other unpleasant emotional companions, include all of the unwholesome mind states that come up when we don't get what we want, when life doesn't deliver on our expectations. And these emotions include anger and disappointment and sadness and despair and grief. And so this dissonance, if you like, between, on the one hand, our extrinsic hopes and our inability to achieve them makes it inevitable that we'll experience suffering. And actually, the yawning gap between what we hope for And what we're actually getting is actually a setup for all these unpleasant emotions. Even if our extrinsic hopes are very worthy and virtuous, the more specific they are and the more desperately we want to attain them, the more suffering we'll experience when life doesn't go our way. And so after I got to that place with my study and realized that most of my hopes were extrinsic and how they were a setup for suffering, I felt even worse than when I started. But thankfully, I found another definition for hope in the dictionary. In addition to defining hope in terms of expectation and desire, there's a secondary, archaic definition in most dictionaries of hope as trust. And this older, this less common meaning, I think, is based on having faith in life without the expectation of achieving particular outcomes or results in the external world. This type of hope comes from within and doesn't depend on achieving improvements in the outside world. And I call this intrinsic hope. And I ended up writing a book about it. Okay, end of commercial break. I call it intrinsic hope. Intrinsic hope is positive, but not necessarily optimistic. It's an attitude to life that does not depend on life conforming with our wishes or desires. Instead, intrinsic hope has an unshakable confidence in life's basic goodness and in our human capacity to respond creatively to whatever happens. I don't know how many of you remember Václav Havel, the former president of Czechoslovakia, and he said this about what I'm calling intrinsic hope. He said, "Hope is above all a state of mind, not a state of the world. It is a dimension of the soul. It is not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not prognostication. It is an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons." End of quote. So what he's talking about here is a different kind of hope, not a hope based on expecting things to get better, not a hope based on projections or predictions, not a hope based on having life go the way we want. Rather, he's talking about a type of hope that comes from inside us. This intrinsic type of hope, it's a faith, a trust, a confidence in the way things are. Not in how we would like things to be, but in how they actually are. And in how they are constantly changing, whether it's our personal lives, the lives of others, or the collective life of our species on this planet. So in this way, I think intrinsic hope is based on the wisdom of impermanence, that knowledge that everything changes and nothing stays the same. We may not know what will happen, but we do know that change is inevitable, and it's that knowledge that's fundamental to intrinsic hope. I think we're all born with this type of hope inside us. It's sewn into our genes, just as it's sewn into the genes of all life. Intrinsic hope is the way a maple tree will scatter thousands of seeds, even though none of them may ever germinate. Or it's the way our Pacific salmon, heavy with eggs, strain to swim up their natal streams to spawn, even though they'll die. And it's the way a dandelion sprouts between the cracks in a downtown sidewalk, even though there's no soil, little sunlight, and lots of pollution. I think that intrinsic hope is life's love for itself. Life's love for itself. In this way, I think intrinsic hope is about aspiration, not expectation. It's about possibility rather than anticipation. Intention rather than goal. Direction rather than destination. With intrinsic hope, I can work to end climate disruption, but I don't expect life to conform to my wishes anytime soon. But that said, I know that letting go of results can be incredibly hard. Thomas Merton, the theologian, said this: "Do not depend on the hope of results, or you may have to face the fact that your work will be apparently worthless and even achieve no result at all, if not results opposite to what you expect." And as you get used to this idea, you start more and more to concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, the truth of the work itself. So I think this notion of intrinsic hope is fully consistent with Buddhism, because for me, Buddhism is a profoundly hopeful faith because it affirms that there is a reliable way to alleviate our suffering and our discontent. In the third noble truth, the Buddha tells us that there is an end to suffering. This isn't theoretical or speculative. He can say this because that was his lived experience. Now, this is something I can feel really hopeful about, but then he goes further. Not only does the Buddha tell us that there's an end to suffering, but he tells us how to do it. Follow the Noble Eightfold Path. This is incredibly hopeful. In other words, the Buddha's telling us we can change, that we don't have to be controlled by fate. We don't have to be condemned to repeat our habitual and harmful and destructive patterns forever. That we can change ourselves and we can change the world for the better. This is very hopeful. But of course, it wasn't just the Buddha. Many of his followers ended their suffering and became enlightened. Not only monks and nuns, but lay people too. We all have this possibility, this potential. And I think it's important that this is not extrinsic hope. The hope of Buddhism is not an expectation or an anticipation. It's not the hope that the Buddha or someone is going to wave a magic wand over us and somehow we'll miraculously be transformed into enlightened beings. Rather, it's based on seeing our own potential for awakening. It's a hope based on our Buddha nature, I might say. Ajahn Thanissaro, Ajahn Jeff, says, "Genuine hope lies in here," pointing to his heart area, "in the potentials you have inside you." That's what I'm talking about, intrinsic hope, this sense of possibility, an awareness of potential that refuses to be limited by present-day circumstances and conditions. So this is an attitude that we can choose. Even though we're all born with it, I think there's a need to choose it and to cultivate it. It depends on our fundamental attitude to life. Viktor Frankl famously said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one last thing: the ability to choose one's attitude, to choose one's own way." So we can choose intrinsic hope. And this means, can we come from love instead of fear? Can we come from compassion instead of anger? Can we stay open and engaged rather than closing down? or distancing. And choosing this attitude of intrinsic hope really matters, because it will determine what we do about the mess that we're in. If we lose hope and give up, then all the gloomy predictions about the future will come true inevitably. But if we nurture this intrinsic hope, then we can cope with whatever happens. I want to end with some words by a Brazilian theologian called Rubem Alves. And this is what he says about hope. What is hope? It is a presentiment that imagination is more real and reality is less real than it looks. It is a hunch that the overwhelming brutality of facts that oppress and repress is not the last word. It is a suspicion that reality is more complex than the realists want us to believe, and that the frontiers of the possible are not determined by the limits of the actual. So let us plant dates, even though those who plant them will never eat them. We must live by the love of what we will never see. This is the secret discipline. It is the refusal to let the creative act be dissolved by immediate sense experience, and it is a stubborn commitment to the future of our grandchildren. So thank you. Thank you for your kind attention.